Ruthless Outlaw gang kills a sheriff. Then his widow picks up his gun. Can you imagine living in a town with no rules? A place where bad men do whatever they want, where good people stay silent, and where justice is nothing but a memory? Briar Ridge used to be safe. Families lived in peace, neighbors looked out for each other, and as long as Sheriff James Carter wore his badge, no one had to be afraid. He was the town's protector, the one who kept order, the one who stood between right and wrong. Until the day he was gunned down in the street. One moment he was standing tall, defending the town. The next, he was on the ground, his badge stolen, his life taken. And in that moment, everything changed. The town fell into darkness. The people looked away. No one dared to fight back. And his wife? She was no fighter. She had never held a gun, never raised her voice, never hurt a soul. She was a teacher, a kind woman, someone who spent her days helping children and her nights waiting at the door for her husband to come home. But that door will never open again. She should run. She should cry for help. That's what they expect. That's what every widow before her has done. But grief does strange things. And sometimes, the softest hearts hold the strongest revenge. Would you run? Or would you pick up his gun and make them pay? Would you let fear control you? Would you let the wicked take everything you love, knowing no one would come to stop them? Or would you stand? Would you fight? Justice is not always kind, it is not always gentle. Sometimes it demands more than a voice, more than patience. Sometimes it demands sacrifice. Because when the law is gone, when the protectors fall, who is left to carry the weight? A grieving widow, a woman with no strength, no training, no reason to believe she could stand against men who had never known fear. But she had something they didn't. She had a cause. She had the memory of a town that was once safe, of children laughing in the streets, of people who trusted in the law, trusted in her husband. She had seen what the world became without justice, and she would not let it stand. She would not be helpless. So she picked up the gun, not because she wanted to, but because someone had to. And if she had to give up the woman she once was, if she had to trade the warmth in her heart for steel in her hands, then so be it. Because there are some things worth fighting for, and there are some men who deserve to pay. The question is, how far would you go to bring justice back? Because once, justice wasn't something Briar Ridge had to fight for. It was simply a way of life. Briar Ridge wasn't just any town. It was a town where everyone knew each other, where neighbors greeted one another by name, and where doors were left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but out of trust. Children played freely in the streets, elders sat on their porches sharing stories, and families gathered in the town square every Sunday for church and community meals. Life was simple, and life was good. And that was because of one man, Sheriff James Carter. James Carter wasn't just the sheriff. He was the heartbeat of the town. He wasn't the kind of man who ruled with fear or force. He led with fairness, with wisdom, with a steady hand that kept Briar Ridge safe. When a dispute broke out between ranchers, James was there to calm the storm with level words and a firm presence. When a traveler arrived in town with nothing but the clothes on his back, James found him work and a warm meal. When a child was lost in the hills, it was James who rode out at first light, bringing them home before the sun had set. He wasn't just the law, he was the protector, the peacemaker, the man people turned to when they needed help. And no matter how tough the job, no matter how long the day, James Carter always had someone waiting for him at home. His wife, Clara Carter. She was the town school teacher, a woman with a warm smile and a gentle voice that could settle even the rowdiest of children. Every morning she rang the old iron bell, calling the children to class. She taught them their letters, their numbers, and the stories of the world beyond Briar Ridge. But more than that, she taught them kindness, patience, and the importance of doing what was right. When a farmer's wife fell ill, it was Clara who brought soup to their doorstep. When a young girl cried because her dress had torn, It was Clara who stitched it back together. She never asked for thanks, never expected anything in return. She simply gave, because that's who she was. Together, James and Clara Carter were the kindest souls Briar Ridge had ever known. A couple so deeply in love, it was rare to see one without the other. James would wait outside the schoolhouse every evening, leaning against the post, hat tipped low over his eyes, grinning as Clara stepped outside. And without fail, she'd smile, take his arm, and together they'd walk home, whispering, laughing, their hands brushing, always touching, always together. They had dreams, big ones. James had spent months fixing up the small piece of land behind their home, building a wooden fence, planting an apple tree. He wanted a place for their future children to run and play. Because after years of waiting, Clara was finally expecting. It wasn't public news yet, but James had already told a few close friends, his excitement impossible to contain. He had started carving a small wooden horse, meant for the baby's cradle. He had even picked a name, Emma if it was a girl, Samuel if it was a boy. Life was good, life was peaceful. But peace doesn't last forever, because some men don't believe in justice. Some men take what they want. Some men thrive on fear. And some men would stop at nothing to burn it all to the ground. One bullet was all it took to turn hope into heartbreak. One act of violence to shatter a family, a town, a future that would never come to be. And when the law dies, what happens next? Who will stand? Who will fight? And how far will one woman go to bring justice back? You won't want to miss what happens next. Make sure to like this video, comment your thoughts below, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss an episode. Now, back to Clara Carter's story, the widow who refused to run, and the revenge that changed everything. The heat pressed down on Briar Ridge like a heavy hand, the air thick and unmoving, the kind of stillness that made people uneasy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, there was a sound. The slow, steady rhythm of horses approaching, faint at first, like a faraway storm rolling over the hills, but with every passing second, it grew louder, heavier, closer. People turned toward the road, their hands pausing in their work, their faces tightening with quiet fear, and before a single word was spoken, shutters creaked as they were pulled shut, doors locked with trembling hands, curtains drawn in hurried movements. The once lively streets emptying in seconds until nothing remained but silence. Because they knew who was coming. Jasper Crow and his gang. There were 6 of them, all dressed in black dusters, their eyes cold and unreadable. They rode into town like they already owned it, grinning, spitting, their hands resting on their holsters. They weren't strangers to Briar Ridge. They had been here before. Years ago, before the town knew peace, Jasper Crow and his gang rode into Briar Ridge like a storm, leaving fear and ruin in their wake. At first, it was small things. A stolen horse, a shattered window, drunken men laughing too loud in the saloon. But soon, they wanted more. They wanted control. Then came the fire. One night, flames swallowed the general store, the heart of the town, taking with it a family's livelihood. Samuel Turner stood in the street, watching his life burn, his wife clutching their... When the sheriff arrived, Samuel grabbed him, his hands shaking. "You're the sheriff! Do something!" But the gang had already vanished, riding off with stolen money and the promise to return. And they did. Days later, they rode in broad daylight, their horses kicking up dust as mothers pulled their children close and shopkeepers locked their doors. Jasper walked into the saloon like he owned it, his men shoving townsfolk aside, smashing bottles, daring anyone to stand up to them. Outside, he dragged Thomas Hayes, the town's oldest man, right off his porch. "Ever been dragged through the dirt, old man?" he sneered, pressing his boot into his chest. The sheriff arrived, standing tall, his voice steady. "Let him go, Crow." Jasper smirked, pressing down harder, testing him. But the sheriff didn't flinch. "This ain't your town," the sheriff said. "And it never will be." Jasper finally stepped back, scooping a handful of dirt and letting it slip through his fingers onto Thomas's chest. "Looks like I already own it, Sheriff." That night, the town gathered, their fear turning into anger, their anger into resolve. They'll come back. We can't just let them take over. They have guns, but we have the sheriff. And the sheriff had a plan. He deputized trusted men, set patrols, and turned rooftops into watchpoints. So when the gang returned, they didn't find a town trembling in fear. They found rifles aimed from above, barricades in the streets, people standing behind their sheriff. Jasper reined in his horse, eyes narrowing. "We ain't looking for a fight," the sheriff said. "Turn around, and no blood needs to be spilled." Jasper weighed his options. He had men, but the sheriff had something stronger, a town that refused to be afraid. With a forced chuckle, he tipped his hat. "We'll be seeing you, Sheriff." And just like that, they left. But Jasper Crow never forgot. For 5 years he waited, nursing his hatred like a wound that refused to heal. Then, one day, the sheriff got the message. A wagon overturned, a traveler shot dead. The gang's mark was clear. The sheriff rode out, tracked them through the hills, and caught them before they could disappear. This time there was no escape. Jasper Crow and his men were shackled, dragged back to Briar Ridge, locked behind the very bars they once laughed at. For 3 years, Jasper sat in prison, counting the days until he was free. And when that day came, he only had one goal: to take back what the sheriff had stolen. And this time, he wouldn't settle for fear. He was coming for blood, back to the present. James didn't fight them with bullets. He fought them with his word, his law, and the people who stood behind him. He had outsmarted them, caught them one by one, and put them behind bars. But prisons don't hold men like Jasper Crow forever. Now they were back, and this time they weren't looking to rob and ride. They wanted revenge. Jasper pulled his horse to a slow stop in the middle of town, his spurs jingling as he stepped onto the dirt road. He scanned the storefronts, the drawn curtains, the shadows of scared people hiding inside their homes. It was exactly how he wanted it. James Carter was already waiting. He stood tall in the street, hat low over his eyes, one hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. He wouldn't be the first to fire. "Been a long time, Sheriff," Jasper said, his voice smooth like he was talking to an old friend. James didn't move, not long enough. Jasper smirked. "I see the town still listens to you. Ain't a soul out here to stop me." "They don't need to," James said calmly. "This ain't their fight." Jasper's grin widened. "No, I reckon it ain't. It's yours." The outlaws behind him chuckled, their hands twitching over their guns. They were itching for a fight. But James didn't reach for his weapon. "I don't want blood in my streets, Crow," he said, voice steady. "You've done enough damage. Take your men and ride on. There's nothing for you here." Jasper's expression darkened. "See, Sheriff? That's where you're wrong." He stepped forward, just a few paces now between him and James. "You put me in chains. Took years of my life, made me a caged animal." His hand clenched into a fist. "You made me watch this town prosper while I rotted in a cell." His voice was rising now, dripping with anger. "And now I'm back, and this town, it's mine." James sighed, shaking his head. "It ain't, Crow." Jasper's hand twitched toward his holster, but James didn't move. He wasn't afraid. He had stared down worse men and walked away with his life. But Jasper wasn't here to talk. Jasper Crow's fingers twitched over his revolver, his smirk still lingering, but his eyes had darkened. "Not while you wear that badge," he muttered, his voice lower now, quieter. The sheriff didn't move. Didn't flinch. "Not while I wear this badge." The town held its breath. The sheriff stood tall, his coat shifting slightly in the breeze, his boots planted firm in the dirt. He had faced down men like Jasper before, men who thought power came from fear, who believed a gun was the only law that mattered. But this time, something felt different. This time, there was no law coming to stop what was about to happen. Jasper's smirk slowly faded. A flicker of something in his eyes. Was it hesitation? Or just the thrill of the kill? The sheriff's grip tightened at his side, his heartbeat steady. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he had something worth living for. He thought of Clara, waiting at home, of the family they were supposed to build together. He thought of Briar Ridge, of the good people who had placed their trust in him. And then, Jasper drew. A flash of steel, a crack of thunder, a single gunshot. The sheriff gasped, a sharp, searing pain ripping through his chest. His breath hitched, his knees buckled. His badge slipped from his coat and hit the dirt with a soft metallic clink. The town stood frozen. The sheriff staggered, his vision blurring, the world tilting around him. He tried to hold himself up, but his body followed his badge to the ground. And just like that, the law had fallen. For a second, the town was frozen in silence. Then, gasps from inside the buildings. Women clutched their mouths, their eyes wide with horror. Men gritted their teeth, their hands clenched into fists. But no one moved. Because in that moment, they realized the truth. It was that easy. The sheriff, their protector, their leader, the man who had stood against every outlaw who ever dared step into Briar Ridge, had been struck down like he was nothing. If he could be taken so easily, what hope did they have? Clara ran to him, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The world around her was a blur. The town, the outlaws, the staring faces, all of it faded away. All she could see was him. She fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she lifted his head into her lap. His face was pale, his breath shallow, his shirt darkening with blood. This couldn't be real. She whispered his name, her voice trembling, as if saying it could bring him back, as if he would open his eyes, smile at her like he always did, and tell her everything would be all right. But he didn't. Memories crashed over her all at once. She saw him standing outside the schoolhouse, waiting for her every evening with that lazy, knowing grin. She heard his laughter as he traced circles on the back of her hand, promising her a life full of love, of children, of growing old together on their quiet little piece of land. She felt his arms around her, steady and strong, the safest place she had ever known. Now he was slipping away, and she couldn't stop it. Her grip tightened on his shirt, her fingers digging into the fabric as if holding on to him could somehow keep him here. But nothing could. Tears streamed down her face, dropping onto his skin as she choked out a broken whisper. "Please, don't leave me." But his body had already gone still. His warmth was fading. And for the first time since she had met him, James Carter was gone. Her husband, her love, her protector, the only man who had ever made her feel safe. And now he was just another name the wind would carry away. But even in his final moments, he had stayed true to who he was. James had never ruled through fear. He had never let his guns speak before his words. He had believed in the law, in fairness, in giving men a chance to do right before resorting to violence. And in the end, that was what cost him his life. Because men like Jasper Crow didn't follow the same rules. James had offered peace, and they had given him a bullet. He had believed that justice could be upheld without cruelty, but the world was not always just. His breath was shallow, his hand trembled as he reached up, pressing something into her palm. The wooden locket. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. Sorry that he wouldn't be there to protect her. Sorry that his way, the way of patience, of mercy, had not been enough. Sorry that she would now have to face this world without him." And as Clara held him, feeling the last of his warmth fade away, she realized kindness alone would not stop men like Jasper Crow. James had followed the law, but she would have to become something else. Clara's world shattered. She gripped his shirt, her shoulders shaking, her sobs breaking the silence of the street. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to grow old together. They were supposed to raise a family. He wasn't supposed to die. Jasper Crow bent down, ripping the sheriff's badge from the dirt. He twirled it in his fingers, studying it for a moment. then slid it into his pocket like a cheap trinket. "This town belongs to me now," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. No one spoke. No one fought back, because Briar Ridge had just learned what fear truly felt like. People stood frozen, their hearts pounding, their hands shaking at their sides. The sheriff had been their wall, their protector, the man who stood between them and chaos, and now he was gone. A sickening truth settled over the town like a heavy fog. Nothing was stopping Jasper Crow now. The butcher clenched his fists, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had once helped him carry sacks of grain when his back gave out. Would his shop be the first place they raided? The widow who ran the boarding house hugged her grandson close, her lips trembling. Would they take what little money she had left? Would they take worse? Parents pulled their children inside, bolting their doors, but deep down, they knew no lock could keep the devil out. The mayor, once a proud man, took a slow step back, then another. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his mind already made up to leave Briar Ridge for good. The deputy, standing stiff on the porch of the jailhouse, felt sweat trickle down his back. He was armed, but what good was a badge now? He gritted his teeth, but his feet refused to move, his courage dying where he stood. And Clara? Clara knelt in the dust, her hands still gripping the man she loved, her mind unable to accept what her eyes saw. Around her, the world blurred, voices muffled, her breath unsteady. She heard the sound of Jasper's boots scuffing the dirt as he turned away. His men followed, laughing, already speaking of what they would take, who they would break first. And no one, not a single soul in Briar Ridge, dared to stop them. Because they all knew it now. Without the sheriff, there was no law. Without the sheriff, there was no one left to protect them. And just like that, Briar Ridge belonged to the outlaws. The days after the sheriff's death blurred together, each one colder than the last. Clara felt like a ghost in her own home. She barely spoke, barely ate, barely moved. The once cozy house where she and her husband had built a life now felt hollow, filled with silence so heavy it suffocated her. His chair sat empty, his boots were still by the door, his scent still lingered on his coat hanging by the wall, but he was gone. She didn't leave the house unless she had to. When she did, it was like walking through a nightmare. Briar Ridge had become unrecognizable. Jasper Crow and his men ruled without mercy. They stormed through the town whenever they pleased, kicking in doors, drinking themselves into a stupor, taking whatever they wanted. Women lowered their eyes, clutching their children close, while men kept their heads down, knowing that one wrong look could be the end of them. There were no more Sunday gatherings in the town square. No more shopkeepers setting up their stalls early in the morning, calling out friendly greetings. No more laughter. The air smelled of whiskey and smoke, and the streets were filled with the sound of boots stomping, gunfire in the distance, and drunken laughter that sent chills down Clara's spine. She saw too much. A shopkeeper who refused to hand over his best stock was beaten in the street until he couldn't stand. A father who tried to defend his daughter was left bleeding in the dirt, his hands trembling as his wife begged for mercy. A boy, no older than 10, was caught trying to sneak bread from the general store. The outlaws made him beg. Then they made him watch as they set fire to what little food the town had left. Clara watched it all, and she did nothing. Because she was weak. She was not a fighter, not a warrior, not her husband. She was a schoolteacher. A woman who had spent her days with children, who had never raised her voice in anger, who had lived a life of kindness and gentleness. She had never held a gun. She had never thrown a punch. She had never known true fear. Until now. Her body was frail from too many days without food. Her hands shook from too many nights spent weeping. Every loud noise made her flinch. Every violent act made her stomach twist. She could still see the sheriff falling in the dirt, his blood pooling around her knees. She had begged him to stay, but now she was alone, and every day without him was worse than the last. She went through the motions, existing but not living. She still rang the school bell every morning, though fewer children came each day. Some families had fled. Some were too afraid to leave their homes. Some had lost too much already. She still cooked simple meals, but she never finished them. She still lay in bed at night, but she never truly slept. She was wasting away. The outlaws barely noticed her. To them, she was nothing. Just a grieving widow, a woman too broken to be a threat. They rode past her without a second glance, laughing, celebrating their victory. And maybe they were right. Maybe she was nothing. Maybe she would always be nothing. But one night, as she sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the wooden locket still clutched in her fingers, something inside her snapped. She had spent every day praying for help, for justice, for someone to put an end to this nightmare. But no one was coming. The sheriff was dead. The town was lost. And if she didn't stand up, no one would. Her fingers tightened around the locket. She had been weak, she had been afraid, but fear had ruled her long enough. And by sunrise, Clara Carter would no longer be the woman they thought she was. Clara was not the woman she had been before. That woman, the school teacher, the wife who waited at the door every night, the woman who believed in kindness above all, was gone. The Clara who stood now was hollowed out, burned away by grief, hardened by the suffering she had been forced to watch. She had prayed, she had pleaded, she had waited for someone to stop the madness. No one had. The law was gone, the town was dying, and the woman she had been would have let it happen. But not anymore. She walked through her house. The same house she had once filled with love and warmth. The same house where she and the sheriff had dreamed of a family. And she opened the floorboards. The sheriff had always been prepared. He had always told her, "A time may come when you'll need to protect yourself." She never thought that day would come. But now, as she pulled out the rifles, the revolvers, the shotgun he had hidden away for years, she realized something. This town would not survive another man like her husband. It needed something else. It needed someone willing to do what the law could not. When Clara stepped outside, the outlaws saw her. They had ignored her before, brushing past her like she was nothing more than a shadow, a broken woman, a widow too lost in grief to be a threat. But now, when their eyes met hers, they faltered. Because Clara Carter was no longer broken. She was cold, unreadable, something dangerous brewing beneath the surface. That night, she followed one of them into the hills. Her heart pounded. She had never fired a gun before. Her hands shook. The outlaw turned, smirking. "You gonna shoot, lady?" She hesitated. Could she do this? Then she saw the sheriff in her mind. His blood on the street, his locket in her palm. Her fear burned away. Bang! The outlaw fell. Clara gasped, her breath coming fast. She had done it, and there was no turning back now. The next morning, the town woke to whispers. An outlaw had been found dead just outside of Briar Ridge, shot, left in the dirt like so many others before him. But this time, it wasn't a message from the gang. It was a message to them. The outlaws tensed. They weren't used to being the ones hunted. They had ruled without question, without fear. But now, something had changed. Jasper Crow's men gathered in the saloon, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the door like they expected someone to come for them next. "Who did it?" one of them muttered. "Ain't no sheriff anymore." But no one had an answer, and that made them nervous. For the first time since taking Briar Ridge, they weren't the only ones watching from the shadows. They were being watched too. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to feel something they hadn't in weeks. Hope. They didn't know who had done it, but someone had. Someone had stood up. Someone had fought back. And that meant they weren't as helpless as they thought. A shopkeeper who had lived in fear of being robbed blind opened his store again. A mother who had kept her children locked inside let them step outside to play. The town square, once silent and empty, had life again. And Clara saw it all. She saw the way people walked a little straighter, the way they no longer avoided eye contact. And she knew she had done that. For the first time since the sheriff's death, she felt purpose. She had been afraid, she had been weak, but not anymore. One outlaw was gone, but there were still more, and she wasn't finished. One by one, the outlaws disappeared. Clara hunted them the way a wolf stalks prey, silent, unseen, striking only when the moment was right. She wasn't reckless. She didn't act out of rage. She waited, watched, learned. She struck from the darkness, from rooftops, from alleyways, never in the same place, never at the same time. And each time she left no trace but a lifeless body. Jasper's men grew restless. They drank more, their laughter forced and uneasy. They glanced over their shoulders, twitching at every sudden noise. They whispered in fear, "She ain't human. He's a ghost. She's coming for us." At first, Clara had felt nothing. No sorrow, no hesitation, only purpose. But then she saw what was happening to the town. As the outlaws dwindled, life began creeping back into Briar Ridge. Shops that had been boarded up for weeks reopened. Farmers who had stopped coming into town brought their goods back to market. People spoke in quiet voices of the widow who was taking back what was stolen from them. And Clara realized something. She wasn't just taking revenge. She was restoring justice. She had felt powerless for so long, trapped in grief, drowning in fear. But now, with every outlaw she took down, she was reclaiming what was lost. The town was beginning to breathe again. And the gang? The gang was beginning to break. They were used to being hunters. Now, they were the hunted. And Jasper Crow? He wasn't afraid, not yet. But that changed one morning, when he woke to find a single bullet on his pillow. No note, no threat, just a message. She was coming for him next. Clara stood outside, watching the first rays of dawn stretch across Briar Ridge. This was it. For the first time since her husband was gunned down, the end was in sight. Jasper Crow had ruled with cruelty, taken everything from her, turned this town into a place of fear and silence. But now, he was the one living in fear. And soon, it would all be over. She should have felt triumph, relief. But instead, a weight settled in her chest. Because no matter how many outlaws she took down, James was still gone. She clutched the wooden locket around her neck, running her thumb over the carving he had made, the initials that once held the promise of a future together. He had been everything this town needed, a man of honor, of patience, of quiet strength. He had spent his years protecting Briar Ridge, not just with a gun, but with his kindness. He had known everyone by name. He had helped farmers rebuild after storms, fixed fences with his own hands, given his last dollar to a family in need. And she could still hear his voice. "As long as I wear this badge, you'll always be safe." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away. Because this wasn't about grief anymore. She turned, looking at the town, at the people slowly stepping back into the streets, at shopkeepers setting up their stalls again, at children daring to laugh, to run, to play. For weeks they had lived in fear. Now they were beginning to believe in something again. Not because she was the law, but because someone had fought for them. And if James could see her now, she hoped he would understand. She wasn't the woman he had married, but she was the woman the town needed her to be. And by nightfall, Briar Ridge would be free. Jasper Crow rode into town one last time. But this time, he was desperate. His men were gone, hunted down one by one. His empire of fear was crumbling. And now, all he had left was a final attempt to regain control. 3 townsfolk stood in the dirt, their hands tied, their faces pale. A father, a son, a woman who had already lost too much. Jasper's voice rang out, sharp and cruel. "Come out, Widow Carter, or these folks die." Briar Ridge held its breath. For weeks, Clara had been a shadow, striking from the dark, never revealing herself. Now they would see her for what she had become. The silence stretched. Then, Clara stepped forward. Her revolver rested at her hip. Her hands no longer shook. She was not the widow they had seen before. She was something else. Jasper smirked, his confidence flickering, but still standing tall. "Ain't got your sheriff now." Clara met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "I don't need one." Her voice was like steel, the voice of a woman who had buried her grief, her fear, and everything she once was. A long pause. Jasper's fingers twitched toward his gun. But Clara already knew. This was it. The moment everything had been leading to. The moment justice was finally being served. It hadn't had to come to this. If they had left the town in peace. If they had walked away. If they had let the sheriff live. The man who had ruled with law, with fairness, with patience. But they had taken that away. They had taken everything. And now, they would answer for it. Jasper moved, but Clara was faster. A single gunshot. Jasper staggered back, his smirk twisting into something else. Shock, pain, fear. He clutched his chest, blood soaking through his fingers, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He fell to his knees, eyes flicking upward, and for the first time, he looked at Clara with something he had never felt before. Defeat. His body hit the dirt. The reign of fear was over. The townsfolk stood frozen. Then, one by one, they began to step forward. Not with fear, but with relief. With hope. Clara stood over Jasper's body, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the people, the town her husband had fought for. The town he had sworn to protect. She had been a widow, a woman drowning in sorrow. But she had chosen not to stay that way. She had picked up the gun, not for revenge, for justice, not for herself, for Briar Ridge. And for the first time since the sheriff had died, the town was free. Clara stood still, her breath steady, her grip firm on the gun. Jasper Crow lay motionless in the dirt, his reign reduced to nothing but a lifeless body beneath the rising sun. The people of Briar Ridge watched, their faces etched with shock, awe, and something else. Gratitude. For the first time in weeks, they weren't afraid. One by one, the townsfolk untied the captives, whispering words of comfort, clutching their loved ones with tears in their eyes. But their gaze kept returning to Clara, the woman they had once pitied, the woman they had once thought was lost. She had changed. She could feel it in her bones. She had spent weeks drowning in sorrow, letting her grief consume her, letting her fear silence her. But when she picked up the gun, she had made a choice. To stop being helpless, to stop waiting for someone else to fix what was broken. She had fought, not for revenge, but for justice. Not for herself, but for the town her husband had sworn to protect. And now it was safe again. Clara exhaled, her fingers loosening around the gun. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. She had been a school teacher, a woman who believed in kindness, in patience, in peace. But Briar Ridge had needed more. And when the time came, she had stood up. She glanced down at Jasper one last time. The man who had tried to break her, the man who had stolen everything from her. But in the end, he hadn't won. Clara had. She lifted her eyes, scanning the faces of the people her husband had loved so dearly. They weren't just townsfolk anymore. They were her people. She had fought for them. And she knew now she would continue to, because Briar Ridge had lost a sheriff. But in the ashes of grief, it had found something new. A protector. The people of Briar Ridge gathered in the streets, silent, their faces touched with both sorrow and gratitude as they watched Clara walk toward the hill overlooking the town, the place where the sheriff rested. The town was safe now. The fear was gone. The outlaws were nothing more than a dark memory. But for Clara, this wasn't victory. It was closure. She knelt before the gravestone, her fingers tracing the name carved into the worn stone. James Carter. The man who had been her world, the man who had given everything to protect these people. Her hand trembled as she pulled the sheriff's badge from her pocket, the metal cool against her palm. It no longer belonged to a dead man. It belonged to the town, to the people who had fought for their freedom. She placed it beside the wooden locket, the same locket he had given her, the same locket he had pressed into her hand as his life slipped away. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred with tears, but her voice was steady. "You kept your promise. Now I'll keep mine." For the first time in weeks, there was no weight in her chest, no fear, no hesitation. She had changed. She had picked up a gun. She had hunted down outlaws. She had become the very thing she never imagined herself to be. But as she rose to her feet and turned back toward the town, she realized something. She was still Clara Carter, the same woman who had spent her days teaching children, the same woman who had once made pies for the neighbors, the same woman who had loved her husband with all her heart. She had fought for justice. But justice hadn't hardened her. It had freed her. Briar Ridge was whole again. The streets were filled with life, with laughter, with hope. People smiled. Shops reopened. Children ran through the town square, their voices ringing through the air like music. The darkness was gone, because someone had dared to stand up and say, "Enough." She turned to the people who had gathered behind her, the ones who had feared, who had suffered, who had lost. She met their eyes, her voice strong yet kind. Fear can take everything from us. It can take our homes, our peace, our loved ones, but only if we let it. There comes a time when we must choose to remain silent or to fight for what's right. James fought for this town until his last breath, and now we fight for ourselves. Briar Ridge will never bow to fear again. The wind carried her words through the hills, and in that moment, she knew the town would never forget. As the sun rose over Briar Ridge, the town had a protector once more. Clara Carter wasn't born to wear a badge, but when justice died, she became it. And yet she knew this was never meant to last forever. She wasn't a sheriff. She wasn't the law. She had fought because she had to, because no one else would, because the town had needed someone to stand when there was no one left. But someday Briar Ridge would need more than a protector in the shadows. Someday it would need a real sheriff again. Someone to uphold the law without a gun in the dark. Someone to carry on what her husband started, not through vengeance, but through order, through peace. And when that day came, when the town found its next leader, Clara knew she would step aside. But until then, as long as justice was threatened, she would be watching. This is a story of justice, a story of loss, a story of what happens when the people who are supposed to protect us are taken away, and the weight of justice falls into the hands of someone who was never meant to carry it. Clara Carter was never a gunslinger. She was a teacher, a wife, a woman who lived a quiet life filled with love and warmth. But sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who stand when no one else will. She could have given up. She could have run. She could have stayed the grieving widow the world expected her to be. But instead, she fought. She proved that justice doesn't always come from strength. It comes from will, from the refusal to let fear win, from the belief that even when the odds are stacked against you, standing up is always worth it. Briar Ridge had lost its sheriff, but it found something else. A fighter, a survivor, someone who refused to let the wicked win. This is the story of the underdog, the underestimated, the ones the world sees as weak, until they rise. And let this be a reminder, never overlook the ones who seem powerless, because when justice is taken from them, they just might be the ones who bring it back. But while Briar Ridge was a place where justice had to be fought for with a gun, the world we live in is different. We don't need to take matters into our own hands. We have laws, authorities, and the right channels to seek justice. When faced with injustice, stand up, speak out, fight for what's right. but do it the right way. Because true justice isn't just about revenge, it's about restoring what is fair and right for all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and let us know your thoughts. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more incredible stories of justice, courage, and those who refuse to be forgotten. Because the fight for justice never ends, and neither do the stories of those who stand for it.